In October 2025, Stephen Pressfield said something on the Huberman Lab podcast that made me stop everything I was doing. He said, "Imagine a tree in the middle of a sunny meadow. The second that tree appears, a shadow's gonna appear. A tree. That's your dream, whatever it is. And the shadow. That's the resistance you're going to feel. And they're directly proportional. The bigger the tree, the bigger the shadow. So when you feel that massive resistance, when that voice in your head is screaming, 'Oh, I want to quit, I'm not good enough to do this,' that's a good sign. It means that tree, that your dream, is really big." And then Pressfield said something that hit me like a bolt of lightning. He said, "Perfectionism is just another form of resistance." Did you hear that? Perfectionism isn't excellence. Perfectionism isn't striving for quality. Perfectionism is resistance in disguise. It's a sophisticated form of sabotage that your shadow uses to prevent you from realizing your full potential. Carl Jung figured this out over 100 years ago. He mapped out exactly how the perfectionist shadow operates. And now, neuroscience is confirming every single word he wrote. But here's the problem. No one has told you this. No one has connected the dots between Jung and Huberman on this specific issue. Until now. Today, I'm going to show you what really happens in your brain when you fall into the perfectionism trap. I'm going to reveal how your shadow uses the mask of excellence to destroy you from the inside out. And I'm going to give you the protocol. That integrates the wisdom of Jung with the neuroscience of Huberman to finally free you from this prison you've built for yourself. But first, you need to understand something fundamental. Jung defined the shadow as all the aspects of your personality that you choose to reject and repress. We all have parts of ourselves that we don't like, or that we think society won't like. So we push those parts into our unconscious. And it's that collection of repressed aspects of our identity that Jung called the shadow. Now pay attention. Jung also defined the persona as the social mask we wear, the image we project to the world. And here's the crucial connection that few understand. To the extent that we identify with a brilliant persona, the shadow becomes correspondingly dark. Persona and shadow are in a compensatory relationship. What does this mean for the perfectionist? It means that the more perfect the image you project, the darker and denser the shadow you carry. The more you strive to appear flawless, the more you are feeding the monster that lives in your unconscious. Jung was direct about this. He said that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If an inferiority is conscious, there is always a chance to correct it. But if it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it is never corrected. Now, connect this with what Pressfield said on the Huberman Lab podcast. He said that resistance will try to distract us. It will try to make us procrastinate. It will try to make us give in to perfectionism, where we are fiddling with one sentence for 3 days, or to fear. Do you understand what's happening here? Perfectionism is the shadow, wearing the mask of excellence, and neuroscience proves this in a chilling way. Recent studies, using functional neuroimaging, have shown something disturbing. Researchers compared the brain activation of clinical perfectionists with a control group of low perfectionism. They found that in specific tasks, perfectionists showed significant reduction in the activation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex. Hold on, let me translate what this means. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain responsible for planning, decision-making, and self-regulation. It's the part that allows us to prioritize long-term goals over immediate rewards. And guess what happens when that area shuts down? You lose the ability to stay on task. You lose the ability to regulate your emotions. You lose the ability to make clear decisions. In other words, perfectionism literally shuts down the part of your brain that you most need to be excellent. And that's because perfectionism activates another system, the fear system. From a neuroscientific perspective, when you face a daunting task, the amygdala fires, triggering feelings of anxiety or fear. And what does the perfectionist do? They postpone the task to maintain emotional comfort. But this postponement solves nothing. It only feeds more fear, more anxiety, more shadow. Huberman summed this up brilliantly in that episode with Pressfield. He said, "The more important it is to the evolution of your soul, the more resistance you're going to experience. But that's the project you should be doing." Did you catch the implication? The resistance, the perfectionism, the shadow. All of this is proportional to the size of your potential. The more you have to offer, the stronger the internal sabotage will be. And Jung knew this. He wrote that the shadow doesn't only consist of morally reprehensible tendencies, but also exhibits a number of good qualities, such as normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, creative impulses. The shadow contains all sorts of qualities, capabilities, and potential, which, if not recognized and assimilated, maintain a state of impoverishment in the personality. Did you understand that? Your perfectionism isn't protecting you from your inferiority. Your perfectionism is hiding your potential, that part of you that you consider imperfect, that part that you try to hide, that part that you repress every day. That part contains exactly the talents, the capabilities, and the insights you need to realize your maximum potential. And perfectionism keeps it all locked away in the shadow. But hold on, because what comes next is even more disturbing. Jung discovered that the relationship between persona and shadow is invariably present in an outbreak of neurosis. That is, when the tension between the perfect mask you wear and the shadow you hide becomes too great, something breaks. And that breaking can take many forms: depression, anxiety, burnout, emotional collapse, self-destructive behaviors, explosions of anger, extreme cynicism, social isolation. Pressfield described this on the Huberman Lab when he talked about how resistance attacks. He said that resistance attacks exactly at the point of greatest vulnerability. And for the perfectionist, the point of greatest vulnerability is the possibility of being seen as imperfect. Neuroscience confirms this. Research shows that individuals with anxiety exhibit hyperactivity in the amygdala and reduced functionality in the prefrontal cortex. This leads to excessive fear responses and difficulty regulating emotions. And what causes this hyperactivity in the amygdala? Chronic stress, constant pressure, the never-ending need to be perfect. The perfectionist lives in a constant state of threat. Their nervous system is always on high alert. Their cortisol levels are always elevated, and this literally changes the structure of their brain. Studies show that chronic stress can result in persistent activation of the HPA axis, leading to changes in brain structures like the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Your perfectionism is literally reshaping your brain to be more anxious, more fearful, less capable of making clear decisions. But here's what no one tells you. There is a way out, and that way out was mapped by Carl Jung and confirmed by Andrew Huberman. Carl Jung called this process shadow integration. It's a process of bringing what's been repressed into consciousness, of looking at the parts of yourself that you've rejected, of accepting that you're human, with flaws, with imperfections, with aspects you don't like. Jung said that shadow integration has a moral aspect, the establishment of more just relationships with yourself and with others, the acceptance of human limits, and the rejection of omnipotent perfectionism in favor of wholeness as completeness. Did you hear that? Rejection of omnipotent perfectionism. Carl Jung wasn't asking you to be mediocre. He was asking you to be whole, complete, real. And Andrew Huberman validates this from a completely different neuroscientific perspective. When you stop fighting against parts of yourself, when you stop repressing, when you accept your full humanity, your nervous system relaxes, your cortisol decreases, your amygdala calms down, and your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex can finally function properly. Stephen Pressfield said on the Huberman Lab podcast that when you feel that massive resistance, you need to do the work anyway. He said, "Resistance is the enemy, but it's also the guide. It shows you where the most important work is." Carl Jung would say the same thing about the shadow. The shadow is the enemy, but it's also the treasure. It holds exactly what you need to become whole. Now, I need to reveal something that Carl Jung discovered about perfectionism specifically. Carl Jung observed that people use social masks, makeup, filtered social media posts, carefully curated presentations of themselves, all to hide perceived flaws and project an image of perfection. These social masks that we all wear, Carl Jung called personas. And here is the cruel paradox of perfectionism. The more you hide behind the perfect persona, the further you get from who you really are. And the further you get from who you really are, the emptier your life becomes. Because true connection, real meaning, genuine fulfillment, all require authenticity. And authenticity is impossible when you're constantly wearing a mask. Andrew Huberman talks a lot about authenticity in his episodes. He talks about how the human nervous system is calibrated to detect incongruence, when someone is faking it, when someone is wearing a mask. We feel it on an unconscious level, and this works internally too. When you're being incongruent with yourself, when you're rejecting parts of yourself, your own nervous system feels that disconnection, and that disconnection generates stress, anxiety, depression. The perfectionist lives in a constant internal civil war. One part of them is trying to be perfect. Another part knows that's impossible. One part is projecting the flawless image. Another part is accumulating anger, fear, shame in the shadow. And that war can never be won by the persona. Because the more the persona wins, the stronger the shadow becomes. Carl Jung was very clear about this. He said that in an outbreak of neurosis, both sides of the shadow are constellated. Those qualities and activities we are not proud of, and new possibilities we never knew existed. So neurosis, the crisis, the breakdown of the perfectionist, isn't just destruction. It's also revelation. It's an opportunity to discover parts of yourself that were hidden, potentials that were repressed, talents that were locked away. But that revelation only happens if you have the courage to look at the shadow. And here's where Huberman's neuroscience becomes practical. Huberman talks extensively about neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself, to form new connections, to change its structure in response to experiences. This means that the damage caused by perfectionism isn't permanent. Your brain can recover. Your brain structures can normalize. Your amygdala can calm down. Your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex can strengthen. But this requires a process, and that process was mapped by Carl Jung and validated by neuroscience. The first step is to recognize that you have a shadow. Seems obvious, but most people spend their entire lives denying it. The perfectionist especially. They believe that if they can just be perfect enough, the shadow will disappear. It won't. The shadow only disappears when it's integrated, when it's brought into the light, when it's accepted as part of who you are. The second step is to identify what's in your shadow. For the perfectionist, it usually includes things like fear of failure, fear of judgment, shame of being normal, anger at having to try so hard, envy of people who seem to have success without so much effort. Carl Jung developed a technique called active imagination to access the shadow. It's a form of meditation where you enter into dialogue with unconscious parts of yourself. Huberman talks about similar techniques when discussing the default mode network, the brain network that activates when we're in reflective states, thinking about ourselves. The third step is to integrate. This doesn't mean becoming your shadow aspects. It means accepting them as part of you. It means stopping fighting against them. It means allowing them to exist without needing to repress them. Carl Jung said that shadow integration expands consciousness, creates new meanings, and releases the energy that was previously spent fighting against the shadow. And this is subjectively experienced as a rebirth of hopes or the return of the feeling of living your own life. Did you catch that? The energy you spend trying to be perfect, trying to hide your flaws, trying to maintain the mask. All that energy is released when you integrate the shadow, and that energy can be directed towards real accomplishment, genuine creation, authentic connection. Pressfield said on the Huberman Lab podcast that the most important moment is when you sit down to do the work, and the resistance attacks. He said that you need to push through that resistance. You have to do the work anyway, and when you do, something magical happens. The resistance starts to diminish. The shadow begins to integrate, and you start to become who you really are. But hold on, before we go any further, I need to tell you something that will completely change your perspective on all of this. Carl Jung discovered that perfectionism has a protective function. It doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It emerges as a defense against something that felt unbearable at some point in your life, usually in childhood. Maybe you learned that you only received love when you were perfect. Maybe you learned that mistakes were punished severely. Maybe you learned that being normal wasn't good enough. And your brain, in its primitive wisdom, created perfectionism as a survival strategy, a way to guarantee love, acceptance, security. The problem is that this strategy that worked when you were a kid is destroying you as an adult. And that's exactly what Carl Jung meant when he talked about neurosis as an attempt at self-healing. The symptom, perfectionism in this case, was originally a solution, but a solution that became the problem. Andrew Huberman talks about this in terms of neuroplasticity. He explains that the brain forms connections based on experiences. If you repeatedly experience that perfection equals safety, your brain formed strong circuits around that belief, and those circuits became automatic, reflexive, unconscious. And that's why perfectionism feels so natural, so obvious, so right. But it's not natural. It's a program, a conditioning, a shadow, and it can be changed. Neuroplasticity teaches us that the brain can reorganize itself at any age. New connections can be formed, old patterns can be weakened, and that requires consistent practice, yes, but it's absolutely possible. Now let me give you the hybrid protocol that combines Carl Jung with Andrew Huberman to integrate the shadow of the perfectionist. First practice. Every morning, before you start any work, set aside 5 minutes for what Carl Jung would call a conscious confrontation with the shadow. Sit in silence, close your eyes, and ask yourself, what am I trying to hide today? What am I afraid of people seeing? Don't judge the answers. Just observe. Just acknowledge. That alone starts to bring the shadow into consciousness. Andrew Huberman talks about how consciousness itself has neuroplastic power. When you bring something to conscious attention, you start to change the circuits associated with it. So that simple act of recognizing your shadow is already initiating the process of integration. Second practice. During the day, pay attention to your moments of resistance. Stephen Pressfield called this the battlefield of resistance. When you feel that urge to postpone, to procrastinate, to keep adjusting details infinitely, stop. Recognize. This is my shadow trying to sabotage me. Andrew Huberman talks about the importance of what he calls cognitive labeling. When you put a name on an internal experience, you activate the prefrontal cortex. That literally calms the amygdala. So by labeling the resistance as shadow, you're using neuroscience to weaken its power. Third practice. At night, do what Carl Jung would call a review of conscience, but with a twist. Instead of asking where you failed, ask, where today did I reject a part of myself? Where did I wear the mask of perfectionism? What was my shadow trying to tell me? This reverses the perfectionist logic. Instead of looking for flaws to correct, you're looking for parts of yourself to integrate. Andrew Huberman talks about the importance of nightly reflection for memory consolidation and learning. By doing this reflection specifically about the shadow, you're programming your brain to process that information during sleep. Fourth practice. Once a week. Do what I call a ritual of intentional imperfection. Choose something to do imperfectly on purpose. It could be an email sent without revising 3 times. It could be a meal cooked sloppily. It could be a project delivered good enough instead of perfect. This will activate your shadow intensely. You'll feel discomfort, anxiety, maybe even anger. Great. Exactly what we want. Because by going through that experience consciously, you're weakening the circuits of perfectionism. Andrew Huberman talks a lot about gradual exposure as a way to overcome fears. That's exactly what we're doing here. Gradual exposure to imperfection. Fifth practice. Find a trusted person with whom you can be imperfect. Someone who will accept you with your flaws. Someone to whom you can show your shadow without fear of judgment. Maybe that's your friend Sarah or your colleague Mark. Carl Jung emphasized that shadow integration doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in relationship. We need witnesses for our complete humanity. Andrew Huberman talks about the importance of social connection for nervous system regulation. When you feel accepted by another person, your nervous system relaxes, your cortisol decreases, and that creates the safe environment necessary for shadow integration. Now, I need to be honest with you about something. This process isn't easy. In fact, it may be one of the most difficult things you've ever done, because you're going to have to look at parts of yourself that you've spent your entire life avoiding. You're going to have to feel emotions that you've spent your entire life repressing. You're going to have to accept truths about yourself that you've spent your entire life denying. Carl Jung was brutally honest about this. He said, "No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The path to integration passes through the shadow. There are no shortcuts. There are no detours. But what's on the other side is extraordinary." Carl Jung described it as the rebirth of hopes, the return of the feeling of living your own life, the release of energy that was trapped in the struggle against the shadow. Andrew Huberman would describe it as positive neuroplasticity, the reshaping of brain circuits, the normalization of the stress system, the optimal functioning of the prefrontal cortex. Stephen Pressfield would describe it as the ability to finally do the work you were born to do, without the resistance stopping you, without the perfectionism sabotaging you, without the shadow controlling you. And it all starts with a simple decision. The decision to stop trying to be perfect. The decision to accept your complete humanity. The decision to look at the shadow. If this content connecting Carl Jung and Andrew Huberman has opened your eyes to something you've never seen before, if you've realized that your perfectionism is actually a shadow in disguise, then you're part of a rare group. Most people will never make that connection. Most will keep chasing perfection until they crash and burn. But you now have knowledge, and knowledge is responsibility. The super thanks button below this video isn't just a button, it's a way for you to say, "I get it. I want more of this connection between deep psychology and neuroscience. I want this work of revealing what academia hides to continue." Every time you click that golden heart, you're funding the next revelation. You're supporting the mission to unite Jung and Huberman in ways that no one else is doing. As Father John Misty once said, "A liberated soul can liberate 100 others." I believe that a perfectionist who integrates their shadow can inspire dozens of others to do the same. Now I want to leave you with one last reflection. Carl Jung once said that you don't become whole by imagining figures of perfection, but by accepting your full humanity. Andrew Huberman would say that you don't optimize your brain by trying to be perfect, but by allowing it to function naturally, without the constant stress of self-criticism. Stephen Pressfield would say that you don't beat resistance by being perfect, but by doing the work anyway, imperfect and all. And I tell you, you don't find peace by trying to eliminate your shadow. You find peace by integrating it, accepting it, making it a part of who you are. Because in the end, there's no such thing as a perfect person. There are whole people. And whole people include light and shadow, strength and weakness, excellence and imperfection. This isn't a permission slip for mediocrity. It's a permission slip for humanity. And the irony is that when you stop trying to be perfect, you often become much better at what you do. Because all that energy that was being spent on self-sabotage can now be directed toward real creation. Carl Jung saw this happen with hundreds of patients. Andrew Huberman sees it happen in neuroscience studies, and I see it happen with people who discover this connection for the first time. So here is my final question for you. Team perfectionism or team integration? Are you going to keep fighting against your shadow, trying to be perfect, spending energy on a war impossible to win? Or are you going to start the process of integration, accept your full humanity, and discover the potential that is hidden in the parts of yourself that you most reject? The choice is yours. But Carl Jung has already warned you, and Andrew Huberman has already confirmed, perfectionism is a prison, and the key is in the shadow. Comment below. Do you identify as a perfectionist? What part of yourself have you been rejecting in the name of being perfect? And more importantly, are you ready to look at the shadow? But before you go, I need to share one more crucial discovery that Jung made about perfectionism. Carl Jung observed something he called enantiodromia. It's a Greek term that means running in the opposite direction. Jung used this concept to describe how every psychological extreme eventually transforms into its opposite. What does that mean for the perfectionist? It means that the extreme pursuit of perfection eventually leads to its opposite, to collapse, to mediocrity, to the complete abandonment of any standards. Have you ever seen this happen? The person who was obsessively organized who suddenly becomes a hoarder. The perfectionist athlete who stops training completely. The meticulous professional who starts delivering sloppy work. That's not weakness. That's enantiodromia. It's the unconscious forcing balance when the conscious refuses to integrate. Andrew Huberman talks about homeostasis, the body's tendency to seek equilibrium. When you force your nervous system in one extreme direction for too long, it eventually compensates by forcing it in the opposite direction. The perfectionist who never rests will eventually collapse into exhaustion. The perfectionist who never makes mistakes will eventually make a catastrophic error. The perfectionist who never shows weakness will eventually be crushed by it. And that's not a distant possibility. It's a mathematical certainty. Carl Jung said that nature doesn't tolerate extremes. The unconscious will always compensate. And the more you resist that compensation, the more violent it will be when it finally happens. So integrating the shadow isn't just about feeling better. It's about psychological survival. It's about avoiding the collapse that inevitably comes when you force perfection for too long. Another thing that Carl Jung discovered that few talk about, perfectionism often masks a deep sense of inadequacy. The perfectionist isn't trying to be excellent. They're trying to prove that they're not defective, and it's a huge difference. Excellence comes from love for the work, for the process, for the growth. Perfectionism comes from fear of being seen as insufficient. And that fear can never be satisfied by perfection, because perfection is never achieved. There's always one more detail to adjust, always one more thing to improve, always one more way to fail. The perfectionist lives in a permanent state of not being good enough, and no achievement changes that. Because the problem isn't in the work, it's in the unconscious belief of inadequacy. Carl Jung identified this as a complex, an autonomous emotional pattern that operates below consciousness and distorts the perception of reality. Andrew Huberman talks about how neural circuits can become autonomous. When a pattern is repeated enough, it no longer needs conscious input. It simply fires automatically in response to certain triggers. So the perfectionist doesn't choose to be a perfectionist. They're driven by an autonomous complex, by automatic neural circuits that were formed long before they were even aware of what was happening. And that's why willpower doesn't work. You can't simply decide to stop being a perfectionist. The pattern is automatic, unconscious, autonomous. What works is awareness, bringing the pattern into the light, seeing how it operates, understanding where it came from, and gradually weakening it through repeated exposure and integration. Carl Jung called this making the unconscious conscious, and he said that, until you do that, the unconscious will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Andrew Huberman would say that you need to create new neural circuits that compete with the old ones, and that requires consistent practice, focused attention, and repeated exposure to experiences that contradict the original belief. Now, when it comes to perfectionism, it all boils down to repeated experiences. Experiences where imperfection doesn't lead to rejection. Experiences where you're seen with flaws and you're still accepted. Experiences where you deliver work that's good enough and the world doesn't end. Each and every one of these experiences weakens the neural circuits wired for perfectionism, and it strengthens the circuits that are wired for self-acceptance. And with enough time, self-acceptance becomes the default, the automatic response, the natural state. But this only happens if you actually start, if you make the decision to integrate your shadow. Today, not tomorrow, not when you feel ready. Today, because the perfectionist will never be ready. That's the ultimate trap of perfectionism. There's always one more thing to do before you begin. There's always more preparation that's necessary. There's always a reason to procrastinate and put things off. Shadow integration. It begins with imperfection. It begins with doing the work. Even when you're not ready, it begins with showing up. Even when you're not perfect. Carl Jung did this in his own life. After his break with Freud, he went through a period of deep crisis, what he famously called his confrontation with the unconscious. He could have waited until he felt ready, until he felt capable, until he had absolute clarity. But he didn't wait. He dove headfirst into the darkness. He confronted his shadow, and from the other side of that confrontation came everything he's now known for, all of his theory, all of his work, all of his legacy. Stephen Pressfield said on the Huberman Lab podcast that you can't wait for inspiration to strike, you need to start. And let inspiration find you in the work. I'm saying you can't wait until you're ready to integrate your shadow. You need to start, and let the integration happen in the process. So, here's my final challenge for you. Today, Chakaito, before you go to sleep, pick one thing you've been perfectionistic about and do it imperfectly, on purpose. Send that email without proofreading it 10 times. Post that content without making it pristine. Deliver that project just good enough. And then observe what happens. Observe the anxiety rising. Observe the resistance kicking in. Observe the shadow screaming. And then observe that the world doesn't end, that you survive, that maybe, and just maybe, imperfection isn't as catastrophic as your shadow has led you to believe. That's the first step, and every step after that gets easier. Carl Jung promised that shadow integration brings a rebirth of hope. Andrew Huberman proves that neuroplasticity allows for change at any age. Stephen Pressfield guarantees that resistance diminishes with practice. The question is this: are you going to take that first step?